Under the glittering chandeliers of Manhattan's most exclusive charity gala, the air seemed to shimmer with expectation, as though the night itself knew a secret it wasn't ready to share. Madison Brooks clutched a tray of smoked salmon with trembling hands, her heart already racing from the weight of unpaid bills and the thought of her father's next round of medication. The shoes on her feet weren't hers. They were borrowed, 2 sizes too large, and she wore them like fragile armor. Every step felt like a gamble, every smile like a mask stitched from necessity. Yet something in the glow of golden light and soft violin music whispered that this evening would not pass quietly. It would be remembered, not for the donations or the speeches, but for one impossible collision of fate. The floor beneath her glittered with marble polished so perfectly it caught reflections like shards of broken stars. And there, glistening almost invisibly, was the cruelest trap, a slick spill of champagne waiting to betray her. Her heel caught, her balance vanished, and in that suspended moment where time stretched into eternity, she fell backward. Plates soared in graceful arcs, salmon slices twinkling like absurd constellations. Her breath locked in her throat until she landed, not on the hard floor, but against the chest of a man whose suit alone was worth more than her year's rent. He was steel and elegance, the kind of presence that made entire rooms hold their breath. His arms caught her instinctively, though his eyes, storm-dark, sharp as glass, narrowed at the wreckage staining his flawless tuxedo. A ripple of silence fell over the gala. 15 investors watched with cold intensity, and it was in that silence that Madison's life tilted on its axis. A stranger's voice, respectful and assured, cut through the hush. "Your wife is quite spirited." Her lips parted to deny it, to laugh it off, but his gaze silenced her, a look hot enough to melt her protests. In flawless Japanese, he answered for them both, weaving her into his world with a single breath. "Darling," he said aloud, smiling as though the word cost him dearly, "perhaps we should freshen up." The word lodged itself in her chest like a dangerous seed. She wasn't his darling, she wasn't his wife, and yet the world around them seemed willing to believe. And so the lie began. Not cruelly, not calculated by her, but born from survival and necessity. He was Harrison Knight, billionaire, a man whose empire balanced on appearances. She was Madison Brooks, waitress, a woman whose world had been shrinking into corners of debt and desperation. Their palms met in a deal disguised as a touch, and lightning surged through her arm, rattling every defense she'd ever built. What could possibly come from a bargain struck in desperation, sealed by electricity neither of them could explain? The ballroom brimmed with champagne flutes and whispers, but Madison felt only the pounding of her heart. He guided her with steady hands, his voice instructing her in subtle murmurs, "Smile softly, say little, let me carry the weight." Yet beneath his polished calm, she sensed a man unraveling, someone who needed her role as much as she needed the money he pressed into her palm. In that instant, they became partners in a performance meant to fool the world, but also, without their knowing, a pair of souls stumbling into the gravity of one another. What began as a lie would stretch into dinners, glances across crystal glasses, mistakes smoothed by improvisation, and a dangerous chemistry that refused to remain hidden. Madison's borrowed heels carried her across a stage she had never auditioned for, but every step brought her deeper into a story no script could contain. And if love is sometimes disguised as chaos, If healing sometimes begins in the most impossible places, then perhaps falling, literally, was the only way she could ever rise. If you feel the warmth of this story touch even a small corner of your heart, let yourself linger here with me. A like, a comment, a gentle subscription to this journey isn't just support. It's energy, healing energy, that allows these stories of love, laughter, and unexpected salvation to keep breathing. Every gesture, no matter how small, becomes part of this shared heartbeat between us. And as Madison steps forward, hand in hand with a man she was never meant to meet, I invite you to walk beside them, because sometimes the greatest romances begin not with perfection, but with disaster dressed in sequins. The night was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun, and already Madison could feel that her world, her carefully balanced survival, was about to spin out of control in ways both terrifying and miraculous. And so the curtain rose on the next act, where every smile might be a secret, and every glance might be a promise waiting to be discovered. The marble doors of the ladies' lounge closed behind them with a muted echo, shutting out the low murmur of investors and the glimmer of chandeliers. Madison steadied herself against the ornate sink, her reflection fractured by the gilt-edged mirror. Her chest rose and fell as if she had run a marathon instead of slipped on champagne. Beside her, Harrison Knight loosened his cufflinks with the same composure he might use to negotiate billions, though the tightness of his jaw betrayed the storm within him. "You told them I was your wife," she whispered, her voice caught between disbelief and outrage. He didn't deny it. Instead, he dragged a hand through his perfectly styled hair, a rare crack in his polished armor. They value stability, family, authenticity. If they suspect fabrication, the deal collapses. 2 billion evaporates overnight. 2 billion. The number spun through her head like an impossible echo. She thought of her father's prescriptions, her rent overdue, the gnawing fear that tomorrow always carried. For him, the stakes were empires. For her, survival. He turned to her then, his dark eyes suddenly unguarded. "I need you to play this role, just for tonight." The plea was buried beneath command, but Madison heard it anyway. His hand dipped into his wallet, the flash of money crisp and undeniable. He pressed folded bills into her palm, the weight enough to make her knees tremble. It wasn't just currency. It was medicine. It was rent. It was breathing space she hadn't known in months. The decision was no longer abstract. It was urgent, real, and pulsing with possibility. She looked down at their joined hands, his touch steady, hers trembling. When their palms met fully, the jolt that passed between them was startling, like the first breath after drowning. He pulled away quickly, clearing his throat, but the warmth lingered in her skin, seeping deeper than she dared admit. "Fine," she said, her voice sharp but her heart unsteady. "But if anyone asks me anything directly, I answer my way." His gaze hardened, almost panicked. "No improvisation. Agree with me, always. That's the only rule." Her lips curved into a defiant smile. "Deal, husband dearest." The word slipped from her with playful venom, but it landed with a strange weight. For a breathless moment, neither of them moved. Then he turned, guiding her toward the door. The hum of the gala returned like an ocean swelling against fragile walls. Madison followed, her pulse thundering as if she'd signed something larger than a contract, something binding in ways neither money nor logic could untangle. Back in the ballroom, the performance began. Investors approached with polite curiosity, their eyes sharp, their questions heavier than crystal champagne flutes. "Madison Knight," he introduced smoothly, as though her borrowed name had always belonged to her. Each time she faltered, he saved her with seamless improvisation. Her cramped studio became their upstate retreat. Her shifts at catering gigs transformed into her way of understanding hospitality from every angle. When champagne touched her lips and her face twisted at its bitterness, he translated it into refined taste for younger vintages. And she, against her better judgment, began to dance within his rhythm. It was dangerous. How easily his hand at her waist steadied her, how naturally his voice wrapped around her lies and turned them into something almost believable. Every brush of his fingers against her skin sent sparks through her, a healing warmth she hadn't expected. For a woman who lived paycheck to paycheck, whose nights were often filled with exhaustion and worry, the sudden safety of his presence was intoxicating. And yet safety was a lie, wasn't it? One misstep, one slip of truth, and both of them would fall harder than she had on the marble floor. The night deepened. Strings swelled from the orchestra, laughter spilled like glitter, and Madison felt the surreal edges of her role blur into something else. When an investor's wife leaned in, sighing at how incredibly genuine their love appeared, Madison found herself unable to look away from Harry's eyes. They mirrored her shock, her confusion, and something else, something neither of them dared name. Their closeness hummed like a secret melody only they could hear, both terrifying and tender. Then the air shifted. A voice, sharp as broken glass, cut across the ballroom. Scarlett Montgomery. She approached with the fire of betrayal in her eyes and the certainty of someone who believed the world owed her obedience. The crowd stirred, the investors leaned in, and Madison's heart threatened to stop. The illusion was about to be tested, stretched, perhaps shattered. She squared her shoulders, feeling Harry's hand tighten around hers. For the first time that night, she wasn't only protecting herself, she was protecting him too. And as Scarlett's heels clicked closer, each step like the toll of a warning bell, Madison realized that this charade was no longer just survival. It had become something else, something dangerous, something healing, something alive. The performance would either bind them together or tear them apart, and the night had only just begun. Scarlett Montgomery stood like a flame in emerald silk, her red hair cascading in waves that shimmered beneath the chandelier's light. The room seemed to tilt toward her, captivated not by her beauty, but by the storm radiating from her eyes. Madison felt the heat of that gaze sweep over her, slicing into her borrowed gown, her trembling hands, the very core of her unpolished self. She had expected disdain, but she hadn't expected such venom laced with grief. "So it's true," Scarlett's voice rang out, smooth and sharp as a violin bow pulled too hard. "You married her. 3 months ago, you swore you weren't ready, Harrison. 3 months ago, you left me with questions, with humiliation, with nothing. And now—" Her eyes landed on Madison, searing. "This?" The hush around them thickened, charged with fascination. Phones were lifted discreetly, whispers spiraled like smoke. Madison's pulse thundered. The lie they carried had been fragile already, but under Scarlett's wrath it seemed seconds away from shattering. She wanted to shrink, to disappear into the cracks of marble flooring, but something within her flared instead, an ember of dignity, of defiance. Harry stepped forward, his tone low, measured, but Madison could feel the tremor beneath it. "Scarlet, this isn't the place." His hand brushed Madison's wrist in a gesture meant to steady her, though the truth was reversed. His touch was desperate, and she became the anchor. Scarlet laughed, brittle and bright. "Oh, but it is. Look at them." She gestured toward the investors, their watchful eyes like an unrelenting jury. "They're your witnesses. They should know what kind of fraud you've committed. Married for 3 years. That's your story. And what was I, Harrison? A pastime while your little waitress wife stayed hidden?" The words struck like darts, and Madison's throat burned. Something protective surged through her chest, sweeping away her fear. No one had the right to reduce her, not Scarlet, not anyone. Straightening her shoulders, she stepped forward, her voice clear though her hands trembled. "Enough! You don't get to humiliate me just because your story didn't end the way you wanted. You don't get to measure my worth with your labels. Call me waitress. Call me whatever you want, but I know what respect looks like, and it's not this." The murmur of the crowd grew louder. Scarlet's lips parted, stunned at Madison's audacity. Harry's breath caught beside her, but his eyes, dark, storm-tossed, shone with something like awe. For the first time, Madison wasn't just playing his wife. She was stepping into a truth neither of them had prepared for. Scarlet recovered quickly, her smirk cold. "Respect. Darling, you've walked into a world you'll never belong to. Class isn't about courage or words. It's about blood, heritage, legacy. He belongs to me, to my world, not yours." Madison's temper sparked, sharp as glass. "If your world teaches you to belittle others, then it's not worth belonging to. And as for him—" Her hand tightened around Harry's tie, pulling him down before she even realized what she was doing. "Let me show you what belonging looks like." The kiss was fire and electricity, an explosion that silenced the room. It wasn't graceful, wasn't rehearsed, but it was real in a way that burned through her skin and carved itself into memory. His lips pressed back with equal force, desperate and hungry, as though he too had been waiting for this truth to break free. The ballroom melted away. Investors, chandeliers, Scarlet's venom, none of it existed. There was only the warmth of his mouth, the rough silk of his breath, the healing rhythm of hearts colliding. When she released him, gasps and applause rolled through the crowd. Scarlet's face blanched with fury, her poise cracking into raw humiliation. Mr. Yamamoto stepped forward, bowing slightly, his expression unreadable, but his words cutting clear. "In Japan, ex-fiancés do not dishonor happy marriages. To sabotage love is to sabotage oneself." The investors nodded, whispers softening into approving hums. Scarlet faltered, her emerald dress shimmering like fading flame. With a final glare, she spun on her heels and vanished into the sea of murmurs. Silence lingered in her wake, but it was a silence filled with awe, not suspicion. Harry's arm curled around Madison's waist instinctively, pulling her close as though she were already his anchor, his shield. His whisper brushed her ear, rough and trembling. "What you did?" He couldn't finish. His voice cracked, caught between gratitude and disbelief. Madison managed a breathless smile. "I wasn't about to let you drown alone." And yet, Deep within, she knew it wasn't just protection that had driven her. It was something terrifyingly fragile, something she couldn't admit to herself. She wanted that kiss as much as she needed the paycheck. As applause still rippled faintly through the hall, Harry guided her away, his hand never leaving hers. The contact burned, healing something inside her she hadn't realized was broken. And as they reached the far corner, away from the sea of eyes, she caught his gaze. There was no mask left on his face, no billionaire polish. Only a man shaken, undone, and captivated. It was in that gaze Madison realized the lie had grown its own pulse, its own heartbeat. The performance was no longer performance. It was a dangerous, intoxicating dance neither of them could control, and one that would only pull them deeper as the night carried them forward. The ballroom gradually exhaled after Scarlett's storming departure, conversations resuming in cautious ripples, glasses clinking as if to erase the echoes of confrontation. Yet for Madison, the air remained thick, every breath heavy with the imprint of that kiss. It had been reckless, a desperate shield against humiliation. But it lingered now like a secret flame in her chest, warming places she had long ago resigned to coldness. Harry kept her close, his palm pressed firmly at her waist as though anchoring them both. For a man who had mastered composure, who had lived years in carefully curated control, there was no disguise left in his eyes. They brimmed with something raw, unguarded, almost fragile. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of both confession and confusion. That wasn't acting. Her throat tightened, but she forced a breathless laugh. Of course it was. What else could it be? Denial was safer, easier. And yet his gaze remained fixed, searching her face as though he could read the truth beneath her words. She turned away quickly, focusing on the gleam of chandeliers, the blur of elegant gowns, anything but him. But the memory of his lips refused to fade, pulsing through her veins like a melody she could not silence. Investors approached once more, their eyes alight with admiration rather than suspicion. Mr. Yamamoto clasped Harry's shoulder with approval, praising the depth of their bond, while his wife pressed Madison's hand warmly, whispering that love this genuine could never be faked. Madison smiled, nodded, played the part with practiced grace, yet inside, the walls of her careful detachment trembled. Every approving glance was a mirror, reflecting a truth she wasn't ready to claim. Later, as the gala wound down and the orchestra softened into gentle notes, Harry guided her into a quieter hallway lined with marble and shadows. The noise of the world dimmed, leaving only the echo of their footsteps and the silence stretched taut between them. He stopped, turning to her fully, his hand brushing against hers. The contact was simple, yet it sent that familiar electric shiver spiraling through her, healing in its intensity, dangerous in its promise. "Why did you protect me?" His voice was softer now, stripped of command. "You could have walked away, let me fall apart. But you didn't." She hesitated, then lifted her chin. "Because I know what it feels like to stand alone while everything crumbles. And I wouldn't wish that on anyone, not even you." The honesty startled her, but once spoken, it couldn't be taken back. His expression shifted, the sharp edges of billionaire detachment melting into something achingly human. In that moment, the facade between them cracked wider. She saw the man beneath the fortune, the boy who had carried responsibilities too large for fragile shoulders, the soul weary of perfection. And he, perhaps for the first time, saw her not as a waitress forced into a role, but as a woman who had courage enough to stand beside him in chaos. Before either could speak again, the sound of heels approached, the swift, precise rhythm of someone who did not belong to idle gossip. A tall assistant appeared, murmuring that cars awaited, investors expected follow-up meetings. Tomorrow held promises and dangers in equal measure. Harry nodded, but his gaze lingered on Madison, as if reluctant to release the fragile thread tying them together. Outside, the city night wrapped them in its restless heartbeat. Madison slipped into the sleek car he held open, the leather cool against her skin, the skyline glowing like a crown of stars through tinted glass. Silence stretched between them, not empty, but charged, filled with unspoken words neither dared voice. Every streetlight flickered across his profile, sharp jaw, weary eyes, lips still touched by her kiss, and she wondered if his heart raced as wildly as hers. By the time they reached his penthouse, exhaustion tugged at her bones, but adrenaline kept her wide awake. The elevator doors opened to a space that belonged more to magazines than reality, glass walls, art sculptures, views that stole breath. She stood uncertain, clutching her borrowed dress around her as though it could shield her from the enormity of this world. Harry watched her, his tie loosened, his voice rough with fatigue and something deeper. "You're safe here." 2 words, simple yet threaded with a promise she hadn't expected. Safe. A word she had rarely believed in, now offered like healing balm to her frayed spirit. She sank onto the leather sofa, the city sprawling beneath her like a dream she could never afford to enter. He poured wine, handed her a glass, and for a long while they said nothing, just sat together in the quiet, strangers bound by lies, yet tethered by something far more powerful than truth. When she finally dared to meet his eyes, she saw the question lingering there, the same question burning inside her. Where did pretending end, and where did something real begin? She didn't have the answer. Neither did he. But as the night folded into dawn, she felt certain of one thing. This was no longer just a charade. It was the fragile beginning of something that could either heal them both or break them beyond repair. And when morning light spilled across the glass walls, painting the room in gold, Madison realized the story had already begun to write itself in ways she could no longer control. The next chapter awaited, unplanned, unstoppable, and filled with promises neither of them yet understood. The first rays of morning stretched across the skyline, soft gold spilling through the towering windows of Harry's penthouse, turning glass and steel into something almost tender. Madison sat at the edge of the sofa, still in last night's gown, her shoes abandoned on the floor. She rubbed at the faint bruise forming on her ankle from the champagne slip, but even the sting seemed far away compared to the chaos tangled inside her chest. Harry stood near the window, phone pressed to his ear, his voice calm and commanding as he spoke in clipped tones about deals, markets, futures. Yet when he glanced back at her, something in his gaze softened, as though her presence reminded him there was more to life than the empire balanced on his shoulders. When the call ended, he crossed the room with deliberate steps, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. Madison blinked at the sight. She hadn't expected a billionaire's kitchen to even have instant coffee, but somehow he had found a way. He offered the mug with a half smile. "Strong. No cream. 2 sugars. Right?" She stared at him, startled. "How did you—" He shrugged lightly, settling beside her. "I pay attention." The words struck deeper than they should have. Few people in her world ever noticed the small things, the quiet preferences that made her feel seen. The warmth of the mug seeped into her hands, spreading like a healing balm through her weary body. For a moment, the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was comforting, as though the city outside had slowed just to let them breathe. "You know this is impossible," she said finally, her voice low, almost swallowed by the hum of traffic below. 2 weeks of pretending. One wrong word and everything collapses. He leaned back, studying her as though she were a puzzle that fascinated him more than any contract. "Then don't think of it as pretending. Think of it as practice." "For what?" she asked. His answer came softly, almost reluctant. "For belonging." The word hung between them, fragile and profound. Madison looked away, her eyes tracing the skyline, but her heart heard the truth, hidden beneath his calm tone. She wanted to scoff, to remind him she didn't belong in his world of glass towers and billion-dollar deals. But then she remembered the kiss, the electricity that had silenced the ballroom. Maybe belonging wasn't about where you came from. Maybe it was about who you found yourself with when the world held its breath. Later that day, he guided her through a whirlwind of lessons: how to walk with poise across marble floors, how to choose the right fork, how to sip wine without flinching. She stumbled, tripped over rugs, laughed too loudly at the wrong moments. She called caviar salty bubbles and nearly broke a crystal glass by holding it too tightly. Yet each mistake drew something unexpected from him. Not annoyance, but laughter, a sound warmer and freer than any reputation she had read about him in glossy magazines. There was one moment, fleeting but powerful, when their hands touched over the rim of a wine glass. Her pulse jumped, his breath faltered, and for a heartbeat they forgot everything: the investors, the lies, the fragile script they had agreed upon. Their eyes locked, and in that unspoken exchange was something both terrifying and healing: the possibility of being truly seen. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in bruised purples and fading gold, Harry took her to the Metropolitan Museum. "A crash course," he explained, his voice teasing but his eyes carrying unspoken urgency. Surrounded by centuries of masterpieces, Madison felt small, out of place, her tongue fumbling with words she didn't understand. She stood before a Jackson Pollock and muttered, "Looks like someone had a paint fight and lost." His sharp intake of breath was both scandalized and amused. "That's worth 50 million. Her cheeks burned, but before she could retreat into shame, he guided her gently to another piece. It was a Norman Rockwell painting, simple, tender, a family gathered around a table. Madison's breath softened. "This one's beautiful," she whispered, her voice steady for once. The father's hands, so worn but strong. The mother's smile, grateful for what they have. The kids don't need more than this moment. Her words flowed without rehearsal, without fear, and when she looked up, Harry was watching her, utterly still. His usual armor of detachment had slipped, replaced by something raw and reverent. "That," he said quietly, "was perfect." For the first time, Madison didn't feel like an imposter. She felt like herself, messy, unpolished, but real. And he, impossibly, seemed to value that more than all the practiced elegance in the world. The cab ride back was filled with unspoken thoughts, their hands brushing occasionally, each touch sparking that same electric warmth. When they reached the restaurant where investors awaited, Madison's stomach twisted with dread. But as Harry squeezed her hand before they stepped inside, his voice was low, certain. "Then we mess it up together." It wasn't just reassurance. It was a promise, binding and gentle, a healing vow wrapped in the simplest words. Madison looked at him, her fear softening beneath the weight of his steadiness, and for the first time since the night had begun, she believed they might actually survive this impossible charade. And so, beneath the glow of chandeliers once again, with the city's elite waiting to dissect every smile and every syllable, Madison stepped forward on Harry's arm, not just as his fake wife, but as something more dangerous, more fragile, more real. The next test had begun, and neither of them could turn back. The restaurant glowed like a cathedral of wealth, every detail sharpened to perfection, the crystal chandeliers dripping with light, the silverware gleaming like weaponry, the walls painted in deep tones that whispered of power and privilege. Madison paused just inside the door, the hum of elegant voices washing over her like a tide she wasn't sure she could swim against. Harry's hand pressed lightly against her back, guiding her forward with quiet certainty, and though every nerve in her body trembled, his touch steadied her more than she wanted to admit. 16 faces turned toward them as they approached the long table, each gaze sharp, weighing, dissecting. Madison forced a smile, fragile but determined. Harry's voice broke through the silence, smooth and confident as he made introductions. "My wife, Madison." He said it with such conviction that for one dizzying second she almost believed it herself. Patricia Rothschild, draped in jewels that could pay off Madison's debts 1,000 times over, leaned forward with a polite smile. "Harrison tells us you're an accomplished painter. How fascinating. I dabble myself, though I admit with little talent." The world tilted. Madison's mouth went dry, panic clawing at her throat. Painter. She could barely sketch stick figures. Her pulse pounded until Harry's hand brushed hers under the table, grounding her, reminding her of their rehearsed script. He answered smoothly before she could drown. "Madison believes art should speak for itself. She's refreshingly modest." Patricia's eyes lit with admiration. How rare. In today's world, everyone clamors for recognition. Your discretion is admirable. Madison swallowed hard, nodding as if humility were her choice rather than necessity. She glanced sideways at Harry, gratitude burning in her chest. He met her gaze, the faintest flicker of reassurance passing between them, and for a moment she didn't feel like she was standing on a cliff's edge. The first course arrived, delicate portions that looked more like abstract sculpture than food. Madison copied the others, but her hands fumbled, choosing the wrong utensil. A man beside her raised an eyebrow at her butter knife poised awkwardly over her plate. Her cheeks flamed. "It's European style," she blurted before she could stop herself. Harry, without missing a beat, added, "My wife studied in Paris for a semester. Some habits linger." "Paris!" Patricia clapped her hands softly. "How delightful! Which arrondissement?" The word sounded like another language entirely. Madison's mind screamed blank. She forced her lips to move. "The artistic one." Patricia sighed dreamily. "Ah, Montmartre, the cafes, the street artists. How romantic." Madison nodded quickly, praying no one noticed the terror beneath her smile. Across the table, Harry hid a smirk, his eyes glinting with something warmer than mockery. Admiration, amusement, maybe even pride. It made her chest tighten, a dangerous warmth unfurling there. Then came the question she hadn't prepared for. Mrs. Patton, her diamonds heavy enough to anchor a ship, leaned forward. "Harrison mentioned your volunteer work at charities. Tell us, dear, what causes speak to your heart?" Madison froze. Her own experiences surged to the surface: hospital corridors, her father's quiet suffering, the weight of unpaid bills. Honesty slipped out before she could mold it into something polished. Families facing medical crises. My father... She paused, her voice trembling, then steadied. My father had heart problems. The bills were overwhelming. I learned how fragile stability can be. The table fell silent. For one aching heartbeat, she thought she had ruined everything. Then Mrs. Patton reached across and clasped her hand with surprising tenderness. My husband survived 3 heart attacks before his surgery. I know exactly what you mean. One by one the others nodded, voices weaving stories of their own, children, parents, spouses, all touched by illness. Madison's chest loosened. These weren't just untouchable titans of wealth. They were people carrying the same fears, the same grief. Her honesty had cracked something open, not just in them, but in Harry too. His voice, softer than she had ever heard, broke the moment. This is why I married her. Madison doesn't just donate. She understands. Her heart stuttered at the way he looked at her when he said it. For a moment, the lie felt like the truest thing in the world. The evening unfolded in a fragile rhythm. She stumbled through silverware rituals, laughed with the teenage daughter of an investor about preferring ice cream cones to sorbet cleansers, nearly dropped her lobster cracker until Harry's fingers brushed hers, guiding her with gentle patience. Each touch sent sparks racing through her, a healing warmth burrowing into her guarded heart. And every time their eyes met across the table, the rest of the world seemed to dim, leaving only the two of them suspended in some secret current. When talk turned to art again, Madison remembered the Rockwell painting, the truth she had seen in it. She found her voice steady this time. Art should move you, not just increase in value. A sketch that tells the truth is worth more than a masterpiece that feels empty. The table leaned in, intrigued. A gallery owner murmured approval. For once, she wasn't just pretending. She was speaking herself into existence. And they listened. Harry's gaze lingered, admiration written across his face so openly it made her breath catch. By dessert, her nerves had softened into something startlingly close to joy. She laughed at a young girl's whispered joke, shared quiet smiles with women who had once seemed untouchable, and when Harry brushed his hand against hers beneath the table, she didn't flinch. She let it stay, their fingers entwining in secret. The contact was simple, healing, but it hummed like a vow. Then her phone buzzed. Again. And again. Madison glanced down, heart dropping as she saw Jenny's frantic messages. A red-haired reporter had come knocking, asking questions about her life, her debts, her catering jobs. Scarlet's shadow had followed them here, and it was growing sharper. Her smile faltered, but she masked it quickly. Across the table, Harry noticed. His eyes narrowed, silently asking, "What's wrong?" She squeezed his hand under the table, both warning and plea. Later. The chandelier light glowed softer now, the dinner winding to its close. The applause of approval was theirs, but the storm beyond the doors waited. Madison knew the night wasn't done with them. The lie had woven itself deep, but truth, sharp and relentless, was already on its way. And as Harry pulled her chair out, his hand resting at the small of her back, she felt the ground shifting. Their performance had carried them this far, but something real, terrifying and beautiful had begun to take root, and there was no pretending it away. The ride back to the penthouse was heavy with silence, the kind that buzzed with too many unspoken words. Madison pressed her forehead lightly against the cool glass of the car window, the city lights smearing into streaks of gold and red. Like a canvas blurred by tears she refused to let fall. Harry sat beside her, his posture rigid, his hands clasped too tightly in his lap. Every few seconds his gaze flicked toward her, then back to the city rushing past, as though he were weighing every possible way to reach her without breaking something fragile between them. Her phone vibrated again in her lap, another urgent message from Jenny. She knows everything. Scarlett has photos, documents, questions I couldn't answer. Please tell me you're okay. Madison's chest tightened. She wanted to reply, to confess the chaos bubbling beneath her ribs, but Harry's presence stopped her. If she showed him the messages now, it would unravel the thin thread of calm holding him together. She slid the phone back into her purse, hiding her trembling fingers beneath its clasp. The elevator ride stretched like an eternity, the hum of cables and gears echoing louder than either of them dared to speak. When the doors slid open into the vast quiet of his penthouse, Madison moved first, pacing across the marble floor with restless energy. The moment the door clicked shut behind them, she let out a sharp breath, the words tumbling before she could stop them. "We're ruined, Harry. Scarlett knows everything. She's digging into my life, my debts, my father's medical bills. She's going to rip this apart." Harry loosened his tie, his face paling at her words. "Tell me exactly what Jenny said." She recited the messages, each syllable tasting like fear. When she finished, she expected him to explode with frustration, to lash out at the fragility of their plan. But instead, he sank into a leather chair, pressing both hands to his face. For a long moment, he was silent. Then his voice emerged, low and steady, but cracked with something vulnerable. "Then we stop pretending." Madison froze. "What do you mean?" He looked up, his eyes stripped of every wall, every mask. "We tell the truth, that we met by accident, that you fell into my lap and somehow into my life, that I've been lying to myself longer than I lied to anyone else." His words hung in the air, fragile, yet searing. "Because, Madison, none of this feels fake anymore. Not the way you make me laugh when I least expect it. Not the way you stood up for me when you could have walked away. Not the way you kissed me like it mattered." Her breath caught, her heart pounding so loud it drowned out the city beyond the glass walls. She wanted to deny it, to insist it was still a charade. But every memory of his touch, his gaze, contradicted her. "Harry," she whispered, her voice trembling, "we barely know each other." He rose, crossing the space between them in 3 quick strides. "I know enough. I know you take your coffee sweet because you think the world is bitter enough. I know you bite your lip when you're nervous. I know you'd rather eat pizza than caviar, but you'll still try caviar if it means not embarrassing me. I know you carry your father's pain like it's your own, and you've turned it into compassion instead of bitterness. That's not pretending, Madison. That's you. And it's everything I didn't know I was missing." Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the sharp lines of his face into something softer, something unbearably real. She wanted to look away, to guard herself, but his hands cupped her face gently, anchoring her in place. The warmth of his palms bled into her skin, a healing comfort she hadn't realized she craved. "Scarlet can't ruin what's real," he murmured, his forehead pressing against hers. "She can try to expose lies, but she can't touch this. Not if we stop running from it." The air between them pulsed with possibility, terrifying and irresistible. Madison's voice cracked as she whispered, "If this is real, then it can't just be about saving your deal or proving something to her. It has to be more." "It is," he said without hesitation, his eyes steady, unflinching. "It's about you. It's about us. And I don't want to waste another second pretending otherwise." Before she could respond, his lips found hers again. This kiss was different. No performance, no audience, no desperation to prove anything. It was slow, tender, a question and an answer in the same breath. It tasted like honesty, like healing, like the fragile beginning of something vast and unstoppable. When they broke apart, Madison's tears slipped free, trailing down her cheeks. Harry brushed them away with his thumbs, his own voice thick with emotion. "Let's take control. Let's make this ours. If Scarlet wants to shout, let her. We'll give her nothing to destroy, because there will be nothing false left." Her laughter burst through the tears, shaky but real. "You're insane." "Maybe," he admitted, a crooked smile tugging at his lips. "But maybe that's exactly what we need." The city hummed beneath them, restless and bright, as though it too knew that something had shifted. Madison leaned into him, her head resting against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. For the first time in years, she felt something she had almost forgotten. Safety, fragile but real, wrapping itself around her like a balm. And though the storm outside waited to break, she realized she wasn't afraid anymore. Whatever came next, headlines, accusations, chaos, they would face it together. Their story had slipped out of the realm of lies and into something neither of them had chosen, but both of them now desperately wanted to keep. As dawn began to bleed across the sky once more, painting his glass walls in gold, Madison closed her eyes and breathed him in. This wasn't the end of their charade. It was the beginning of their truth, messy and healing and terrifyingly beautiful. And the world, with all its noise and judgment, would have to wait, because for now there was only this: two hearts learning how to be real in a life built on pretense. The city had not yet fully awakened, its streets carrying the hush of dawn, when Madison found herself standing in front of Harry's floor-to-ceiling windows in a borrowed dress that shimmered faintly in the gold of morning. Her reflection was fragile, almost dreamlike, a woman caught between two worlds, between the life she had known and the life she had stumbled into. Behind her, the penthouse stirred softly with the scent of coffee and white roses, reminders of a night that had rewritten everything. Harry appeared quietly, his navy suit jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his hair mussed from running restless hands through it. He held a small bouquet, ivory roses bound with a ribbon, impossibly perfect for the hour, and in his eyes was none of the steel, none of the guarded distance she had seen before. He looked at her as though she was the only certainty left in a life built on shifting foundations. "You look like yourself," he whispered, his voice rough with awe. Not a socialite, not a role, not a woman pretending, just Madison. His words wrapped around her like healing silk, soft and steady, stitching together pieces she had thought would always remain broken. Moments later, Judge Morrison's kind eyes and warm presence filled the room. Candles flickered in delicate halos, the roses glowing in the pale dawn light, and Madison realized she was about to do something entirely insane. Marry a man she had known for just over a day. Yet her heart was no longer racing with fear, it was racing with possibility. Harry spoke first, his vows steady, though his hands trembled when he reached for hers. "You turned my life upside down," he confessed, "and somehow it feels like it finally makes sense. I promise to love your honesty, even when it terrifies me, to protect your heart as though it were the only treasure worth having, to remind you every single day that real is better than perfect, and that nothing matters more than the laughter we find together." Madison's tears blurred the golden sunrise. She clutched his hands, her own voice shaking yet strong. "I thought I knew how small my life was meant to be," she whispered. "But you showed me that even the most ordinary girl can crash into something extraordinary. I promise to love you without pretending, without masks, to choose you even when life is messy, even when we're scared, to make a home out of truth, not perfection. And to hold your heart with both hands for as long as I'm blessed to have it." The exchange of rings was simple, 2 gold bands gleaming like circles of eternity, and yet the weight of them pressed into her skin with the gravity of forever. When Harry kissed her, it wasn't the staged kiss of the gala or the desperate kiss of defiance. It was soft, reverent, filled with hope. A promise sealed in warmth. The penthouse filled with quiet applause from the few witnesses who had helped prepare the ceremony. Outside, the sky opened with color, pink and amber, washing the city in light. Madison leaned into Harry's chest, his arms folding around her like shelter. "We're married," she murmured, tasting both disbelief and joy. "Completely, officially, irrevocably," he replied, his lips brushing the crown of her head. And for the first time in her life, she felt what it meant to belong, not because of borrowed gowns or forged stories, but because someone had chosen her exactly as she was. Later, wrapped in his jacket on the terrace, she watched the city stir awake beneath them. Harry held her hand, his thumb tracing absent circles over her skin, each touch grounding, each circle a quiet vow repeated. She breathed him in, breathed the warmth of morning, and let herself believe that love could heal even the most fractured beginnings. When Scarlett's story finally broke across the media, it did not destroy them. Photographs of their vows and their smiles turned whispers of scandal into a love story the city could not stop admiring. And Madison, once just a waitress with too many debts and too many fears, stood hand in hand with Harry Knight, no longer pretending, no longer apologizing for being herself. The noise of the world would come, with its judgments and its demands, but in that sacred space between sunrise and reality, she knew what mattered. Love, messy and wild, had chosen her, and she had chosen it back. If this story has touched you, if even for a moment you felt the warmth of their journey settle into your own heart, let it stay alive. Leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so we can keep walking together through stories of love, healing, and second chances. Your support is more than a click. It's a spark that keeps these tales glowing, a reminder that every heart deserves to find its place, no matter how unexpected the beginning.